Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my joint host today is Dennis Broe. And that's because, as some of you may already know, in addition to this audio podcast for Cultural Studies, we're doing something special and different together that includes the magic of video. Dennis, maybe you could explain that a little bit.
Okay, I'm not sure how magic we are on screen, but let's say it's magic. But might be black magic actually, or dark magic. Anyway, so this podcast is called Culture and Barbarism, and we use the ampersand actually as if it were a corporation because maybe it is at this point. And our tagline is the podcast is about the politics of culture and the culture of politics. And Rosa Luxemburg, the German revolutionary, famously said the choices between culture and barbarism, or culture or barbarism, but perhaps today what we have is culture and barbarism, and that's what we're going to explore, taking a kind of cultural studies approach to many different topics.
And just a quick note on backgrounds. First of all, apologies that I was unable today to change my virtual background of the Mediterranean. Bit of a fake since I'm in Mexico. But close viewers, textual analysts with a record, will note that Dennis has chosen to record today in a place that has roof beams that match his hair color. Very fetching, I think.
Yes,
And
I was able to to actually knock a beam down and bring it to my hairdresser. And he said, "No, no problem. I can do this, but would you please get the beam out of my office?" And we proceeded from there. Anyway, yeah.
so what we're going to talk about in the first part today is sports. And in
Yes,
particular,
before we do, you know what? I just wanted to go back to last episode, our pilot episode, in which Toby gave a really good description. He is in Mexico, I'm in Paris, and our guest today is in New York. So we're connecting three different places, but he gave a very good description of what's going on in Mexico, and particularly around drugs and guns, and where the guns come from, which make Mexico so dangerous that it is, they come from the US. There's a case now before the Supreme Court. And I wanted to just pick up on something in terms of Mexico, and to come back to that in a way, to come back to Mexico in a way, and also to talk about, sort of media representation, which is really one of our main topics. So what happened while we were away from last week was, Trump's tariffs went into effect. So he threatened Canada and Mexico with these huge tariffs. So Canada didn't really do much about them. But what happened in the interim after Trump threatened the tariffs, Lula, the president of Brazil, invited Mexico to join BRICS. Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and South Africa, which now has more members than that, and just welcomed Indonesia into the group. And BRICS is a kind of global South network, which also does sort of financing, and it is a challenge to the West. And what happened after that was Trump, said, well, you know what, these we're going to take these tariffs, and we're going to do a 30-day cooling off period. So what was the cooling off period about? Well, it was probably about they hadn't calculated that Mexico could actually has had options and could actually join BRICS, which would really upset what's, the sort of Monroe Doctrine, or the extension of Biden's what's it called? Rules-based order, which means we make the rules and we keep the order. But in Trump's version is the reinstitution of the Monroe Doctrine. We do make the rules and we are the order in Latin America. Well, maybe not so much anymore. Maybe Mexico has options. And what I want to say in terms of the press is this never made it into the press. It was simply viewed as Trump being crazy, chaotic, and not knowing what he's doing. And the point I want to make is that view of Trump is it sort of lets out the complexity of what's going on. That, in other words, this is, Trump's flailing is being played out against a fading empire and also against a global South that's rising up. And that is not being covered in the press. So it just looks like Trump's just being chaotic as he's always being. Now he is being chaotic. He is lashing out. He is, it is not well thought out, but partly what's not thought out is the sense that there are options now, and this is not the world of 10 years ago, even with the coming of BRICS. So that's what I wanted to say, and I kind of wanted to add that to what we were talking about in Mexico last time.
I couldn't agree more. And here in Mexico, as in Canada, there's been a rush of public opinion in support of the current administration for standing up to the orange comb over and the man-child. And I think that that's been enormously important in shoring up President Sheinbaum's support. So quickly on to sports then. We'll just do a little bit on this and the media. And one of the things we're going to do is I'll talk very generally about this, connected to my book, Why Journalism, that came out last year to great fanfare. At least 3 people bought copies, and I probably paid for all of them. And one of the chapters...
It's a great read. It's a great read. It's a cultural studies view of an area, of journalism. And there's a great chapter on sports reporting, and all the issues around sports. That's really quite enlightening. And that broadens the contours of anyone thinking about sports. So I think it makes a really real contribution to the field.
Well, thanks, Dennis. And this chapter is co-authored with David Rowe. And really what we tried to do was to talk about the context for this, because although sports are enormously popular and incredibly significant in both the conventional bourgeois media and the emergent media, they're often regarded as unimportant, insignificant in journalistic terms. Historically, sports reporters were known in the Anglo world as the guys in the toy room, right? Because they weren't doing serious journalism that was never going to be on the front page, and so on. And one of the interesting aspects to that is that, of course, it's continued to be an area very dominated by men in the global north, very dominated by white men. But there's been a massive technological and regulatory transformation that has shifted what sports mean. The first big transformation is the deregulation in Europe, in particular, of the electronic media in the decade after the Cold War, in particular, when there's a rush to get subscribers to sign up to cable, pardon me, and satellite. And in a period of minimal macroeconomic inflation, the rights to watching football, by which I mean real football, i.e. where people use their feet in order to kick a ball and their head to head the ball, the rights prices for the top 5 European leagues increased by almost 1,000% in that decade. And Rupert Murdoch, sadly well known in many parishes, coined the expression a battering ram as his use of sports to gain subscribers to his cable and satellite systems. At the same time, deregulation meant that what had been legal requirements for television networks and often radio stations to provide what one might call comprehensive services. So that would mean the weather, drama, news, sports, music, was eroded, and what the Spanish call thematic channels or specialized channels could come about. So what had been the case for a long time in the United States, so sports channels on TV like ESPN or the old sports channel or the Fox Sports network, became the norm in Western Europe. So this meant that for the first time, these white guys doing sports reporting were not marginalized as people in the toy room in terms of the mostly men doing the real reporting of international politics, of war, of health, of economics, and so on. Suddenly they became much more significant. And now with the next transformation, what we're seeing is, of course, the rapid movement into sports of streamers and also of the tech bros. So Amazon and Apple and Netflix are outbidding, both in the United States and in Europe, the traditional television broadcasters to get control of the national, in inverted commas, football league, Major League Soccer, Major League Baseball, the National Basketball Association, and elsewhere, things like association football. All of that means that has meant to a certain extent, along with other tendencies like campaigns by feminists and by people of color, that the complexion, let's say, of sports journalists is changing. Because what's also going on, and I'll cease in a moment, and then we'll go to Dennis with a particular set of examples to talk about in the current conjuncture, is that the desired demographic group of people watching, consuming sports has shifted. Lots of sports now care about queer viewers, care about women viewers, and are no longer obsessed with the idea of capturing the male, in inverted commas, one of the slogans that used to be used. In addition to which, for the last 10 to 15 years, the use of artificial intelligence in sports journalism has increased quite dramatically, because the wire services that used to send people out to games to write reports and then shoot them back to the mothership, as it were, now don't do that. They use artificial intelligence to scoop up information from other sources. So there are these major political, economic, regulatory, technological shifts in sports journalism that on the one hand have made it less of, in a sense, the second or third tier of journalism, given it more importance and autonomy, on the other, made it subject to all sorts of new social forces. Dennis.
Yeah, lots to add there. That's a very good summary of what's going on. I would say also that, yes, as you said, in the streaming era now, just to sort of piggyback what you were saying, sports has become much more important because it is the thing that draws live audiences. And the thing that these streamers are trying to do now is to combine live audiences, that is what the networks can deliver, with their own streamed, which you can watch at any time. So these things are becoming more important. There was a big thing. Netflix on Christmas grabbed the entire day in terms of American football, the kind you throw instead of kick. And so they had two games on Christmas, and then they had Beyonce at the halftime in Texas, doing her thing from Cowboy Carter. So they captured the entire day in a day that usually went for the networks. I want to say one other thing too about this, that a lot of the time the streaming looks like, wow, it's accessible to more people. Well, the thing to remember is accessible to more people, but it's paid. That is, more content is being locked up on the streamers, just like before movies were locked up, as just like, and television series that used to be available, at least in the US, on network TV for free, now are paid. So, the idea is to grab some of this stuff that everybody wants to see and then watch the subscriptions flow in, like Netflix did on Christmas. So it is always, I think, good to keep in mind that these are paid subscription services instead of free services. That is, we're in this new neoliberal era where everything costs. Everything's available, but everything costs. I just want to say that, to add to what you're saying.
No, thanks very much, Dennis. And now we want to move on to a topic that is of greater seriousness, of geopolitical import, and where the truth has been almost impossible to get at in conventional journalistic terms because of comprehensive censorship. And at this point, I'd like to welcome our
guest. Before we bring in Layan, who's in the green room, I did want to talk, sort of flesh out what Toby said and talk a bit about the Dallas Mavericks, which I think is going to go seamlessly into talking to Layan, I hope. Okay, so this is about sports journalism again. It's called Depleting the Dallas Mavericks, a tale of greed, gambling, and avarice. On February 2nd of this year, in the dead of night or under cover of darkness, perhaps the strangest, or as the sports commentators put it, most puzzling trade in the history of the National Basketball Association occurred. Luka Doncic, one of the two or three best players in the league, who had led the franchise to the NBA Finals last season, was traded to their rival in the Western Conference, the Los Angeles Lakers, essentially for Anthony Davis, who was perhaps the 10th best player in the league. Doncic at the time was 25, Davis 31. That is, Doncic has at least 6 more productive years at his peak than Davis, who is probably starting a slow decline. In addition, Davis is known around the league as Mr. Glass because he is so fragile and can so easily be broken. Indeed, in his first game for the Mavericks, he sustained an injury which has taken him off the court for a month. The Mavericks are tanking thanks also to the loss of their now best player, Kyrie Irving, the only player in the NBA this season to be sporting the NBA shooting crown of 50, 40, 90. 50% from the field, 40% on coveted three-point shots, and 90% from the free throw line. It's said that part of the reason for Kyrie's season-ending injury is his being overworked after the trade. Doncic, meanwhile, who has been injured for part of the season, has returned and over the last few games is averaging 31 points and keeping the Lakers, without for the moment their other star, LeBron James, afloat. The trade is being blamed on general manager Nico Harrison, but that makes little sense. Harrison, who reached out to the Lakers and initiated the trade, is a savvy general manager whose 2 acquisitions last season at the trade deadline helped propel the Mavericks to the finals. Yes, they needed more defense to win the championship. Davis is one of the best defensive players in the league, Doncic one of the worst, but that could have been accomplished with Harrison making the kind of moves he made last year and without trading away the franchise player and without receiving comparable worth. The team, upon hearing about the trade, in the words of Kyrie Irving, was grieving, and the fans have been staging protests outside and inside the arena. The national sports reporters have thrown up their hands and claimed to not be able to understand the trade, with ESPN Sports Network Dean Stephen A. Smith, who, beyond the bombast, is actually quite perceptive, claiming that the real beneficiaries of the trade were the reporters, who can now have as much fun kicking around another Dallas franchise as they have mocking the football Dallas Cowboys. The problem here lies not with the general manager, but with the ownership. And that is a place network sports reporting, except to make fun of bumbling hires, does not and dares not go. As Dave Zirin put it in The Nation, the trade felt like it came out of spite. So why was it made, and who engineered this trade? The team was bought in 2023 by Miriam Adelson, whose son-in-law Patrick Dumont oversees the Mavericks and refers to himself as the governor of the franchise. Adelson, whose fortune, along with that of her now-deceased husband, is anchored by gambling halls in Vegas and now expanding overseas as well, had in 2024 an estimated net worth of $32 billion, making her the richest Israeli and 8th richest woman in the world. She is an avowed Zionist and a huge supporter of both Israel and Donald Trump, donating $100 million to his campaign and his inauguration, where she sat in the front row ahead of the legislators and with a trio of like-minded oligarchs, Amazon's Jeff Bezos, Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg, and Tesla's Elon Musk. Trump awarded her the Congressional Medal of Freedom in 2018. Makes you think of the Congressional Medal of Honor winner John Kennedy, with Adelson's request and admonition being, ask not what your country can do for you, but what your country can do for Israel. When irate fans appeared at the Dallas arena with t-shirts with Adelson and a clown nose, or mouthing a criticism when they showed up on the Jumbotron during a kiss cam, they were seized by security guards and ordered out of the building. No protest was allowed, in a way that echoed the current repression on college campuses and the silencing of the left in Israel. 3 possible reasons have been suggested, all of them in my mind plausible. The first, and probably slightest, but not insubstantial, is that Doncic is Slovenian and played on the Slovenian national team in the Olympics last summer. Just before the Olympic trials, Slovenia became the 4th European country, along with Norway, Ireland, and Spain to recognize Palestine as a state, seeing in its struggle for freedom a comparable struggle to Slovenia in its breakaway from Yugoslavia. This couldn't have been anything but irksome for the maverick Zionist leadership in the moment when Israel was and still is carrying out what Amnesty International has called a genocide, designed to eliminate any future claims for a Palestinian state or for single state equality. The second factor involves, of course, money. Had Doncic stayed in Dallas, he was eligible at the end of the season for a supermax contract where he would be paid $345 million. With the trade to LA, that eligibility is voided. It's very possible the Adelsons wanted to put their money elsewhere. Adelson's stated project in Israel is the illegal annexation of the West Bank, but she is also a builder, and when Trump outlines his plan for building a luxury condo in Gaza, she is a possible natural partner for the construction, especially if the plans include gambling facilities, another Adelson specialty. She and her money have exerted a great influence on Trump's thinking around Israel, and she is so thankful for him that she once claimed there should be a book in the Bible named Trump. So future schoolboys and girls will then be asked to recite the first 6 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Trump. By the way, as builders, the Adelsons are very Trump-like. Their Vegas flagship resort casino, the Venetian, has been involved in lengthy feuds with subcontractors for not paying them, and with the Culinary Workers Union for opening a non-union shop in what is one of the strongest union towns in the U.S. Last year, they finally approved the contract, making them the last resort on the Strip to unionize. They've also been lax on workers' safety, and 3 workers have been killed on their sites, as well as being accused of using their former casino for money laundering. The third reason for the trade, though, is probably the most crucial. Texas has limited gambling in the state, and large-scale gambling resorts are illegal. Adelson has poured millions into the state legislature trying to get these laws rescinded and open up the state so she can make it another Vegas centered around a massive construction of a new Mavericks arena just outside of Dallas. She contributed $13.7 million to mostly Republican legislators last year to get these restrictions rescinded, but to no effect. The laws still stand. The depleting of the franchise by ridding it of its superstar may have been a warning to the lawmakers that if they do not legalize large-scale gambling in the state, the Adelsons will simply move the franchise, which generates $116 million a year for the Texas economy. Depleting the team lowers its value, but also turns fans off, thus creating the conditions for either a move out of the state to Vegas or, more probably, threatens the legislators into approving gambling so the franchise remains in the state and can be part of a seamless basketball gambling resort where the two are utterly intertwined, just as they now are in Adelson's home state of Vegas. The difference being that Dallas-Fort Worth is a much larger and probably more preferred market. Where 10 years ago gambling was still on the fringes of professional sports, now it is in the center. Vegas, once anathema to sports franchises who did not want to be tainted with the charge of bettors fixing games, now has football, hockey, women's basketball, and soccer professional teams, with the baseball team on the way, and with college sports events now being held there, including the epitome of those games, the finals of the college basketball tournament scheduled there for 2028. A study has shown that money for sports gambling, which since it is online is now as ubiquitous as pornography, is principally not coming from prior winnings, but rather from day-to-day expenditures and contributing to increased bankruptcies, inability to pay loans, and exorbitant debt collection fees. Gambling is recognized as an addiction in the latest mental health study, DSM-5, and as Dostoevsky vividly illustrates, his gambler, after winning 600 francs in an hour, then, quote, started to lose. I couldn't control myself and lost everything. After that, I took my last money and went to play. The Doncic trade then may have been designed to open the Texas gambling floodgates for its working and middle-class Mavericks audiences, ever more devastated by Trump's government cutbacks and coming tax giveaways to billionaires like the Adelsons. Their compensation: start making every moment count. That's the phrase used by sports betting companies like FanDuel to rope fans in and get them to make the first bet, where the probability is then 50% that they will make another one and that the betting will increase 8 times over the next 3 years. Welcome to Casino World in Gaza and Dallas.
Well, thank you, Dennis. And now we really do want to welcome our guest. My apologies for stuffing things up earlier with the timing. And what we normally do is invite that person, this anonymous figure who people can see in front of us, to state their name. And if they want to add anything else about themselves, to go ahead. Does that sound all right as a way of proceeding?
I think I have a little bit of an introduction for Layan, who I've been listening to and who's very, very interesting. She's our first guest on the podcast. She's an educator, a scholar, and an activist. She's the education director of the People's Forum in New York. She's the editor of 1804 Books and has recently written an introduction to a new translation of a book titled The Revolution of 1936 to 39 in Palestine. And she's an activist and organizer. So, this is Women's History Month. Can you tell us a bit about Palestinian women and their part in the resistance, both historically and today, and say anything else you'd like to say about yourself?
Well, sure. And thanks so much for having me on. I think this is such an important time to be talking about this history and these issues, obviously, because of the moment that we're in, the resumption of all-out genocidal war by all means over the past few days, I think has taken the world by shock. We had all hoped that we would have seen an end to this level of aggression, and we're back here now. So the more we can talk about not just what's happening right now, but actually what it means to struggle for Palestinian liberation, what the history of the struggle has looked like, and to understand actually the Palestinian cause and all of its details is super urgent. So I really appreciate that you're bringing this here to your podcast. So as you mentioned, it's Women's History Month. And women, of course, play a major, if not the leading role in all instances, I would say, of resistance across human history. And it's no different in Palestine. I think that we all know that Western media, capitalist media, more accurately, capitalist media that is financed by generally US and European global capital, has its own narrative of the role of Palestinian women in society. One of a victim of society, one that is oppressed, that is not an agent of societal change, of societal action. And of course, while patriarchy is a global reality under global capitalism, nobody is going to say that there's anywhere here on planet Earth that is free of patriarchy. Of course, things look different in different places. But the Palestinian society is actually a very special place to be thinking about this, because the social fabric of Palestinian society is very tightly woven, and particularly around the concept of resistance. Oftentimes when people talk about resistance, they're thinking only of armed resistance, which people can perceive now. Over the past year and a half, everyone is watching the videos coming from the Palestinian resistance factions. They're also watching and listening to the Zionist narrative of what the Palestinian resistance is. We're now in a moment in the United States, and which is not new, in which actual Palestinian resistance groups have been labeled as terrorist organizations. And so to actually speak about and it becomes now criminalized action in the United States. But the Palestinian definition of resistance is actually much broader than armed resistance. Armed resistance is a part of it, but Palestinian resistance against occupation, against colonialism, against imperialism is something that takes every single sector of society and human life. And women have been at the forefront of all of those different fronts of struggle. The idea of popular resistance is developed, I think, really strongly throughout the history of the Palestinian struggle. Women leading strikes, building committees, organizing society in the first and second Intifada, extremely active in all the different diversity of forms of tactics, boycotts, alternative education, creating new ways of self-sustenance and survival. But in this past period of genocide, I think is even the most important and most immediate way that people can see it. I mean, how has a society, a group of people, a population who is being brutalized by the weight of the strongest and richest military powers in the world, all their weaponry being dropped on this population. The horror of the brutality is something we can't say in words, and can't even really perceive by just watching the images. That's still not bringing us close to the actual horror of the experience. But Palestinian women and Palestinian society overall, it's very hard for me to separate Palestinian women from Palestinian society because of the tightness of the social fabric, have managed to not only resist the bombing and stay steadfast and not waver from the horizon of Palestinian liberation, not say that we are, okay, fine, we'll give up and surrender our lands. No, never. Standing firm on the land, standing firm on the cause of Palestinian struggle. Not only has Palestinian society, led by Palestinian women, resisted, but has also continued to organize. I mean, the way in which, for example, emergency committees in Gaza immediately began to form. The Israelis had assassinated basically any local official they possibly could. I mean, they targeted police agents. They targeted local governance figures, councilmen, the heads of emergency committees that had been established. The people of Gaza over and over again reorganize and reorganize. So when aid comes in, how do you distribute that aid? The people of Gaza organized for this. When there's no medical supplies and you need to deal with thousands of wounded people, how is that done? The people of Gaza have organized. The imagery is of women going out into in between bullets to rescue wounded compatriots is constant. So I think this is what I want to kind of put forward as, I could have gone the other route and I could have named the Palestinian women resistance leaders and fighters that we know, Layla Khalid, Shadia Abu Ghazala. There's this rich history of Palestinian women who have led the resistance at different moments of history. But I actually wanted to lead with this, which is what this moment teaches us, and what I think we should emphasize is that actually the participation and the leadership of Palestinian women in society, the unnamed Palestinian women, is actually this. It's the organization of society, the steadfastness that can produce. And that's really the greatest weapon against this brutal genocidal war machine.
Very important point. Thank you, Layan. Since we did talk, you are talking a bit historically, you've just written the introduction to this book, The Revolution of 1936 and 39, which has just been translated into English. I wonder if you could talk just briefly about the book and what the intervention it makes, because I think it's quite an important, makes quite an important intervention. So I'll let you talk about it.
Sure. Well, this book is a new English translation of one of Ghassan Kanafani's most famous political texts, the 1936 to 1939 revolution in Palestine. It actually had been already translated into English in 1970, in the early 1970s, I think 1972, the same year that Ghassan Kanafani was assassinated. But we actually did a new translation, updating some of the vocabulary with the idea that this is actually very important for, in particular, the young generation of people who have been awoken by the Palestine cause, who are participating in the movement, international solidarity movement for Palestine, and in many ways, most importantly, the Palestinian diaspora, which due to the occupation is flung across all continents. The project of national unity is so important still, and that reading and knowing our own history is very important for that project. So we wanted to be able to get this book into more readers' hands. It's a very important, I would say, concrete analysis of context, to use the Leninist term, or conjunctural analysis, to use another way of putting it, of a particular historical moment that Ghassan Kanafani identified as essential in order to understand the condition of the Palestinian people. He wrote this he started writing this in 1969, and it took him a year or 2 years to actually do the study. It's a very thorough study, and what he produced is a synthesized, concise document as a result of that study. This is right after the 1967 war, in which the Palestinian struggle suffered major setbacks. Actually, the Arabs struggle overall suffered major setbacks in the 1967 war. It was in the process of being reorganized afterwards. And Kanafani, I mentioned this in the introduction because I think it's important context. Kanafani, in this moment, decided to spend time studying the 1936 to 1939 revolution, which he concludes. I'm giving you a spoiler, but it's not really a spoiler because this is an analytical text. He concludes that it was actually the defeat of the 1936 revolution, which included a general strike, multiple general strikes, the activation of the entire Palestinian society, almost in the first time against the Zionist project, which at the time was still coming into formation. It had its early origins in process for a few decades, but it was combined with the actual colonial project of the British mandate. And so it was in that moment that the Zionist project crystallized for the Palestinian people, and the resistance to it and to British imperialism also became a national project. The defeat of the 1936 and 1939 period is what he says set the stage for the possibility of the Nakba, or the 1948 ethnic cleansing project that established the Zionist state of Israel. So we wanted people to read this, one, to know the history, to know why we are where we are now, but also to have an example of a real revolutionary analysis of history. And the way Kanafani did it, as you know, he was not a historian, he was not simply a journalist, he was not simply a writer, he was actually a party leader. He was the founder of one of the founding members of the PFLP. He was the spokesman. He drafted the political line. He was studying history in order to better understand how to move forward in his current moment, his current context. And that's a skill that we think that we all need to continue practicing, learning. And it's a great example of that text.
I wonder if I could ask a question there. It's about Marxism and feminism. You used Leninist vocabulary, and you use the term conjuncture. And so I wondered if you could sketch for us, both in terms of your own analysis, but also in terms of the Palestinian struggle, the significance of Marxist theory and politics and of feminist theory and politics for that world.
That's a huge question.
I hate to interrupt, but I just wanted to make one more point about the book, and that is, I think this book is very important for American audiences, because the best I think American audiences know about what goes on in the Middle East it's like the Middle East begins in 1948. Although for most Americans, the Middle East begins on, with October, 2023. But it's very important to understand, I think, that there is a history, and this makes a real intervention and really sort of sets the idea that there's a history, a culture, a people there that is being erased. And I think that's a major contribution this book makes. And now I'll let you go on to answer the other question.
Sure. No, I agree with you, and I think we need to actually, part of what we do at 1804 Books, I'm one of the editors at 1804 Books. It's a project here that's housed in the People's Forum, is actually that we do a lot of this, that we are starting to try to recover the revolutionary texts that we think are going to contribute the way this text has to the consciousness of people in struggle today. But to Toby's question, I think that, I feel in many ways inadequate to be able to answer in a concise way. I need to do my own process of synthesizing a longer history. But Marxism and Marxist thought is in many ways the foundation of many anti-colonial projects and struggles across the world, but in particular in the Arab region. Leading up to the 67 moment, we saw of the Arab region actually engaging with Marxism in a very active way. And this is actually not it's not necessarily because the entire world was engaging with Marxism. There's a moment in which, the Soviet Union had already had the first victorious revolution that in many ways inspired both the anti-colonial projects as well as the more socialist projects in more developed regions of the world, because Russia in and of itself was both was relatable to people both in both circumstances in the world. You have this concrete reality in front of you that revolution is possible, and the wave that inspired, plus the material support that the Soviet Union was able to give, also meant that people had access to Marxist literature, to Marxist thinkers, to be engaging and discussing Marxism. But it's not, to me, when I study the history of anti-colonial struggle, I don't usually find that Marxism ended up in a region in that kind of top-down manner. I think what's so interesting actually about the Arab region, and Kanafani talks about this, Kanafani's comrades talk about this, is that actually many Arab revolutionaries at first had some suspicions about Marxism. Why? Because the Soviet Union was one of the first countries to acknowledge the state of Israel. It was actually, I think, the first. And they felt that to be a betrayal. Of course, there's many accidents of history that happen. We know that socialist projects are not some sort of pure thing where every single decision they make is the correct decision. We have to go through history, and like all of us as human beings, we have to learn from our context. Within 9 months, it was already, the recognition was withdrawn. Zionism was understood to be a fascist project in the Soviet Union. It was a short-lived strategic calculation that then was reversed. But that created some sort of hesitation among Arab revolutionaries to engage with Marxism. Quickly disappeared, not because anyone came to convince people, no, you should follow the Soviet Union, but because actually Marxism and the science that it elaborates is not something outside of any territory, actually. When you're struggling against colonialism and struggling against imperialism, and then trying to define what the organization of society is going to look like, Marxism is useful. It is helpful. It actually it is naturally helpful. And I think Kanafani talks about this explicitly, that in fact, it became inevitable that him and his comrades began to study Marxism and ask questions about capitalism and go towards socialism, because actually it is a science that can be applied in any conditions, and the conditions then determine the decisions that you would take as a Marxist. It's not like this kind of top-down thing. There's similar examples everywhere across the world. Amilcar Cabral, very similar process of discovering Marxism. It's not being convinced from the top down. It's something that emerged as a useful tool as you're trying to confront similar questions as other people across the world. Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Mariátegui in Peru, and each one of them, including in Palestine, Lebanon, Mahdi Amel in Lebanon, then created their own realm of Marxist thought and theory and contributions that were developed out of those contexts. So I'm giving kind of a general answer because it's a really big question, but I think oftentimes people forget that how much Marxist practice, and in particular Marxist and Leninist practice in the Middle East region, shaped the resistance and continues to shape the resistance project of the peoples of the Arab region. And in fact, that this is a method that can be applied to understand any historical moment. It's not sort of like a brand that people pick up and put down in different moments. It's really actually elaborating a way of thinking.
Thank you. We know you have to leave pretty soon, but I just wanted to get you in the last few minutes. As an organizer, there's a major struggle on college campuses where in the spring there was great resistance to the genocide in Gaza, but since the fall, this is met with great repression. Wonder if you could just talk a little bit about where the movement is now, and perhaps mention something about the case of Mahmud Khalil, which is very much in the headlines at the moment.
Well, I'll start where you ended. Mahmoud is still being held illegally in detention in Louisiana. It was announced yesterday that he will be moved to New Jersey, but we don't have a timeline on that yet. The Trump administration, I'm sure, wanted him to stay in Louisiana, where the courts would be more favorable to a Trump agenda. But Mahmoud was basically kidnapped from his residence by plainclothes officers who clearly were unprepared They did not know, they thought he had a student visa. They must have been getting their information. We can speculate, feels pretty close to reality, that they got their information from right-wing extremists and Zionist groups who told the government that he had a visa. And instead of fact-checking, they went for it. When they found out he had a green card, they said, well, we'll take it. This is the Trump mode of operation, to just try to bully your way through anything and see what sticks. Well, they're trying to make an example out of Mahmoud. It has completely backfired. Just to be quick here, we could talk for a long time about Mahmoud's case. They're trying to make an example out of Mahmoud because they want to keep going. They already have. There's been multiple other, I would call them kidnappings and deportations now of students on student visas, and others because of their political views, their pro-Palestine political views, and oftentimes not even just their pro-Palestine political views, criticism of Trump, their views on how research budgets should be allocated. So the political motivations for deportation is something that the Trump administration wants to roll out. Now, I think that they really hoped that the arrest of Mahmoud would scare the movement into silence, allow them to not only continue arresting and deporting people, but resume the full-scale genocidal war as they have done over the past 48 hours. The Israelis did this in complete consultation and coordination with the White House. But it's completely backfired. The day after the news of Mahmoud came out, there were masses of people, maybe 10,000 people in New York City. Since then, people across the country have been out in the streets every single day, even in Louisiana, where the detention center where Mahmoud is being held is in the middle of nowhere, very hard to get to. There was still a protest outside, and hopefully he could hear it. He's released a beautiful letter from his detention center, speaking to the movement, encouraging the movement, thanking the movement. We have to understand that Mahmoud is continuing to and was fighting for Palestine. This is why he has been arrested. This is why he's been detained. This is why the movement is also paying a lot of attention to his case, because the Palestine movement has become a critical factor in US society at this point. It has transformed public opinion in an irrevocable manner. Never again is there ever going to be popular support for the Zionist project. It's just impossible to imagine now. And the attack on the movement is not simply just an attack on individual activists. It's an attempt to ask the Palestine movement to sit down. We can see that's not going to happen. There's been already the day after the night that the genocide war began again. The next day, emergency protests took place in dozens of cities across the country. Whether or not the media reports on it doesn't mean it's not happening and that the media is not aware of it and that the White House is not aware of it. We want the world to be aware of it. The Palestine movement is not going anywhere. Mahmoud has the majority of people's support on his side, which means that the Palestine movement has people's support on its side. I think it's very impactful and important political moment here, and to understand that Trump has already failed. If the idea was to create a climate of fear, he's doing the opposite. He's picked the wrong movement to fight with, and I also think that this is going to be an anchor for many different groups who are struggling against the Trump agenda to also gain confidence. I mean, Trump's attack on immigrants is brutal and horrific. What he's done to the way that he has been shipping out Venezuelan and other immigrants in horrible conditions of torture, bringing people to Guantanamo, sending people to random third countries with nothing, chaining people. This is not something that the US public is going to stand for. And the Palestine movement has shown people actually that you can stand up and fight for your rights. So I think this is going to be a major player in the coming period.
Thank you very much, Leanne. That was really wonderful. So thank you for being our first guest on Culture and Barbarism and talking about both culture and barbarism.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
Great. Okay. So we will see you. And so Toby, now it's kind of I was just sort of thinking we began with kind of Trump flailing and finding out that when you just flail and shoot from the hip, lots of things can happen. But one of the things that can happen is it can come back and, well, as I say, bite you in the face. And so here we have this thing of, just flailing out, arresting Mahmud Khalil, who really there's no action they can accuse him of. It's clearly what he said. And so what Trump has done in thinking that he's going to suppress dissent is revive it, at a point where it was at a low point and now people are rallying. So anyway, we've kind of gone full circle in our podcast today.
I hear what you're saying, Dennis, and it makes the point again to me of the difference between the way certain campuses respond to this versus others. The gutless violence generated on US Research One campuses is in stark contrast to what I've experienced over the last 2 years in Spain, where, yes, there were Pacific occupations of campus territory by students, people putting down tents, living there. Guess what the reaction was? Let's talk.
Yeah.
Institutional reaction was, let's form committees involving student protesters to talk about our relationship to Israel.
Right.
Very sensible, academic, participatory, all the things that I think are the values of the, in inverted commas, liberal university.
Yes. And possibly contributing to Spain then acknowledging the Palestinian state. So they did talk and they did arrive at a progressive conclusion. I have to say, too, though, in terms of the repression. So I was in LA last summer and I wrote about what happened at UCLA, what happened at USC and what happened at UCLA. And it was really horrible, and when the encampment was attacked, part of what came out was it was likely that these sort of thugs attacking the encampment, part of them were ex-IDF, Israeli Defense Fund, people who were in Los Angeles. And when they went through and started wailing on people, it was really pretty awful. And I wrote an article about it because the media described it as clashes. Now, clashes implies that there are two equal opponents and they're having a battle, when basically what was happened was the protesters were beaten. By the way, the killing of the Alawites in Syria, which has been really sort of a mass slaughter, has been described by the New York Times as clashes. Well, okay, can you have a clash between people who are being bombed and people who are unarmed? Okay, well, I don't know what kind of a clash that is. There are other words for that.
This leads me to ask a question of you about journalism in general, Dennis. And it's this. The way in which the bourgeois media and its supporters in academia and elsewhere rant and rave about disinformation and misinformation, as if this were an invention of nerdy boys who don't wash their hair often enough and live in their mother's cellars, or dubious operatives of the Russian state,
Right.
Presumes that there has been and is a real alternative in conventional journalism. But if we go back, let's just take it 20 years, a little over 20 years, to the campaigning done by the Washington Post and the New York Times on behalf of the Pentagon in terms of the invasion of Iraq. But we could go back decades before that and ever since. It seems to me that part of the problem here is that there never was this golden age of journalism, and that the so-called liberal media are reactionary creatures and always have been of DC. What's your take?
I love the phrase, the new phrase that the Europeans are using, France, Britain, and Germany, coalition of the willing. as if they don't know that that was the phrase that was used to attack Iraq. I mean, and the media doesn't question it. They just trot out the new coalition of the willing, you know. It's really sort of wild. I mean, yeah, I don't know how much these things ever really do change, you know. And Yeah, I mean, I think also that Trump's victory and the way he conducted his campaign has also occasioned a big change in the media, rightly or wrongly. Corporate mainstream media is really losing credence. It's losing credibility as it loses ratings. CNN, MSNBC have both been spun off by their owners who no longer want to be that associated with them because they're seeing them go down the tank, um, and you know, so and podcasts are doing better than network TV. Jimmy Dore has got a wider audience, and George Galloway than some of the people on CNN who are trumpeted, who have the platform because they have the advertising behind them. But there's a real sea change, I think, which is sort of questioning this, maybe sort of falling in line and maybe sort of, falling in the far right, but it certainly is questioning what's going on. And I think it's healthy. I think it's healthy to have, to have this questioning going on.
One of the things that strikes me, Dennis, and you too, because we are people who, despite my accent, identify as US people, but who spend a lot of time outside the country, is that if you watch CNN in another country, it's actually not a bad network. It actually has respectable news gathering and serious, sincere reporting. If you watch it at home, it's just people shouting at one another and a bunch of opinions. Yeah. You could say the same about Fox News in the United States, by contrast with Sky News in Britain, which is a very good, owned by the same people, very good place for serious reportage, in which, of course, conventional views dominate, but where there is not mass hysteria and a valorization of, to use the term you deployed earlier, clashes, where these really are clashes. But, a guy I went to high school with is actually a right-wing pundit on Sky News in Australia, which is a far-right organ of the Murdochs. He's a person who, because I've known him, and here I'm carbon dating myself, for well over 50 years, is in my heart and I care for. But he sprouts the most, from our perspective, if I can use that term, appalling positions on everything from climate change to Zionism to Trump. When I ask my friend, as I have done, about this, he says, well, in the green room, the liberal voice and I agree on what we'll disagree on and how much we'll disagree on. And the producers understand that we will both be more extreme in our statements and more polarized than is actually the case. Yeah. Ha, ha, ha. This is our game. Now, I think that this goes back to CNN's Crossfire, which I guess started in the late 80s, early 90s, Dennis, which was this model of setting up a so-called liberal voice and a so-called conservative voice to dispute topics. And to me, that also relates to a further problem with US journalism, which is the notion that there are two positions on everything. There is this binary, liberal and conservative. Mm-hmm. Yes. And in the case of climate science, for decades, the idea that you must hear alternative voices. Give me a break. Anyway, there's my Crossfire-like rant.
Yes, that's very good. I want to just remember the famous quote from Leslie Moonves in Trump's first, running, where they said, "Why do you keep covering Trump? It's not that important what he's saying. He's not saying that much." And Leslie Moonves famously said, "Trump may be bad for the U.S., but he's very good for CBS." That's one thing. And I just in that mode, the other thing is in the US is the pressure of the 24-hour news cycle, where you really can't do a lot of thoughtful news reporting, and everybody tends to say the same thing. So something gets going and it has its own steam, and people just keep piling on, and these networks, the three CBS, NBC, CBS, and Fox, which is sort of slightly, which is on the other end, but the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, they just operate within the same circle and they just keep pushing the same story. And the story doesn't really go anywhere until, the next cycle where you have to have the next thing. And part of that is, I've always thought, part of that is that to not have to do real reporting is cheaper than if you actually have to go out and report on a story, So the pressure of the 24-hour cycle and of getting ratings, that's also conditioned this, in a way. So
No, I couldn't agree more. And the thing that strikes me is that if I want serious reportage, I go to the Financial Times.
Exactly right.
And The Economist and France 24. France 24.
Yeah.
Because they have the resources for different reasons to tell you what's actually happening. Now, sometimes the ideological perspective is a problem for me, but they actually see beyond those blinkers to tell you things.
Yeah, or at least they cover things. They cover more things. Now, I always think that the purpose is that businessmen do not want to be led astray by ideology. They're after about making money, and if you don't give them the real story, they're going to abandon you.
There's no point. Well, my father was a correspondent for The Economist for a quarter of a century, and it really was just the facts, and it didn't matter whether the facts were inimical to capital, because as you say, these people need to know the truth in order to keep making the wheels turn. So I've got one last thing I wanted to ask, and it's a question of you, Dennis. If people ask me about you, my answer is he's a scholar, he's a novelist, he's a journalist. Which of the three best describes you, and are you still happy to be called a journalist, given all that we've said?
I think the one that doesn't describe me at the moment is scholar. I hate to say it. Sorry about that. No, it's true. I mean, well, I wear two different hats depending on what part of the year we are in. So right now, next week I go to Series Mania in Lille for a week of watching television series and writing about the latest developments in television, and I leave the novel, which I've just finished 11 books about the history of pornography in Los Angeles and Porn Valley, which is the San Fernando Valley, because that's the next book. But, at the moment, I also really enjoy being part of this new eco-structure in terms of journalism. So I don't consider myself to be a mainstream journalist. I consider myself to be, on the fringes, and I'm very happy to be on the fringes. That's where I belong. And even if I wanted to, that's where I'm going to end up. So, but I'm very happy being there.
That's a lovely description. I appreciate it. So I guess we'll be back again, folks, in a little while.
Yes.
And for now, just a reminder that this will take at least two forms, maybe three. One form will be an audio podcast of the whole thing, including all my missteps, which will be part of the Cultural Studies podcast. And then there'll be a slicker, more professional, properly put together video version, thanks to Dennis and colleagues, that'll be part of Rosa Luxemburg 2025, Culture and Barbarism, and then maybe other outlets too.
Yes, and a nod to our editor, Sean O'Dwyer, who's a very, very good editor, actually, who helps with the visuals, helps clean up our visuals.
Many thanks to Sean, especially, and apologies from me that he still has to cope with the Mediterranean in the background. I'll try to fix that up for next time. So many thanks to our wonderful guest today. It's so refreshing to get a voice that is prepared to speak about the importance of the Pacific as well as the armed resistance, and also prepared to use Marxist vocabulary and historiography in so profound a way. So it was great. And Dennis, thanks also for your amazing ability to link you know, sports journalism to Zionism. That was fantastic.
You know, I was trying to sort of, I'll just say, I was trying to follow in your footsteps, and I was trying to sort of expand the field of sports reporting, you know, because it could have a more holistic, there could be a more holistic approach to it. It needn't stop at the game, you know, and if it doesn't stop at the game, there's a lot more, and there's a lot more ways that you can engage the audience, you know.
Well, if you think of one of the doyens of journalism in United States history, it's Roger Angell, who certainly knew his baseball, but was also a terrific writer and was prepared to look at the political economy and the culture as well as the game.
Yep. Yeah, and Dave Zirin does that today, and it was one of his articles that I read, you know, and partly putting this together. Yep.
Absolutely. Hats off to Dave Zirin and his frequent collaborator, Jules Boykoff. Between the two of them, they've produced extraordinary ethnographic, political, economic accounts of not only US sports, but the World Cup of men's football, the Summer Olympics, and so on. Greatly valuable.
Yep.
So,
okay, well, we are off to wherever we are, and but we will be back from Mexico, Paris, and who knows, next week or next time for more of culture and barbarism. And